Ordinary Numbers by Cryptarium. Chapter 9. November 2012. Taylor played anxiously with his mobile phone. Not the phone, but his personal one, the one listed in his MI6 file as his primary contact number. He'd memorized James's phone number by now, and he was tempted to call, but he didn't dare. The hospital was crawling with MI6 security and emergency staff who were primarily administering oxygen and handing out plasters. At a sharp look from a rather fearsome nurse, he held the oxygen mask back up to his face and breathed. Of all the stupid bloody things, he'd passed out from the smoke, and thank God he'd been on the landing instead of the stairs. But when they'd pulled him out, they'd left his laptop behind. His MI6-issued laptop with his login and a very, very illegal set of programs all loaded and happily running. And even if the battery died, all they'd have to do was plug it in, and they'd see what he'd been doing. He wanted to go home. He wanted to call James. He took another breath of cool, dizzyingly pure oxygen and wondered how he could best escape. When he heard his name called, he hoped it was the physician on duty. One last checkup and he'd be free to go, right? He stood up from the creaky plastic chair, abandoning the oxygen mask. "Taylor here," he said loudly, looking around for whoever had called him. Immediately, he regretted his cheerful compliance. It wasn't a physician in a comforting white lab coat, but a uniformed, armor-wearing MI6 soldier, complete with some sort of machine gun held across his chest. He walked over with long strides and asked, "Michael Taylor, HD 4191. The coughing fit he succumbed to wasn't faked in any way whatsoever. It was simply brought on by his breath hitching in panic. The concerned look the guard gave him was slightly reassuring, if only slightly. "Sorry," he said with a weak smile when he was done. He knew there was no point in fighting it. He'd just get shot if he tried to run away, and he'd had enough conversations with James to know how unpleasant that was. "Yes, that's me." Instead of answering Taylor, the guard put a finger to his ear and said, "We have him, sir. Bringing you to your location now." Then, looking directly at Taylor, he said, "Come with me, please." Lovely. He was being politely arrested or detained since he hadn't been read his rights. Not that MI6 needed to, did they? They could just drag him to some underground bunker or secret warehouse and have him shot. He remembered James' joking comment about the underground cages, but couldn't smile. James was living it up in Greece. He wouldn't come to the rescue after all. Taylor's heart sank at the thought. He was brought out to a black SUV parked in the ambulance-only area. Tinted windows, thick tires, the body probably armored. Wonderful. He obediently got into the back, alone, which was a nice surprise. He hadn't been searched and wasn't handcuffed. He had his mobile. Alec, he thought, but he didn't want to do anything obvious, so he waited. The SUV's side windows were black, but he could see a little bit out of the widescreen. Over the guard's shoulder, he'd been asked to fasten his seatbelt, which trapped him behind the guard in the front passenger seat. They didn't drive far before they went into darkness, and he remembered the underground cages all over again. It wasn't a parking garage, but a tunnel, one that went on and on forever, or so it felt. The driver was a soldier, too, and drove as if he was under enemy fire. The headlamps flashed on curved brick walls only inches away from the sides of the vehicle, and Taylor flinched more than once at the sharp turn that never quite scraped the SUV, but came damned close. Then they came to an open area where they halted before a single door painted the color of murk. Neither black nor brown nor green, but all of them at once. The passenger side soldier got out and opened Taylor's door. "This way." Taylor got out, wondering if he'd just quietly gone to his death, and then a little bit of irritation curled through him as he realized he was being a coward. He had nothing to fear. Yes, he'd broken the rules, but he'd saved lives. He'd saved the rest of MI6. Feeling vindicated, if not actually relieved, he followed the soldier into the sort of tunnel that would have fascinated Taylor any other day. He loved exploring old ruins. Now he just concentrated on maintaining that very fine core of resolve and not letting it dissipate like fog. He was brought into what looked like a World War II bunker, almost exactly like the one in the Doctor Who episode with Winston Churchill. The air was unpleasantly cold and damp, making him cough twice until he tried to suppress it. The echoes were violently loud. Taylor. The call this time came from a somewhat harried-looking man in a very nice suit. He was standing on a balcony halfway up the wall. "Up there, can you handle stairs?" he asked, pointing to a set of brick stairs at the far side of the balcony. Well, he wasn't in chains and irons, or whatever those dungeon-style restraints were called, so that was another good sign, he thought. He started, voice rough. "I think so. But if I have a coughing fit, I hope you have some oxygen handy." The man in the suit was watching patiently, not angrily, as Taylor started slowly up the stairs, feeling better about his situation by the second. The man offered him a hand, saying, "Bill Donner, Chief of Staff." Taylor couldn't hide his surprise. "So, what can I do for you?" He had an idea of what might be going on, but deliberately ignored the sinking sensation in his stomach until his fears were confirmed. "Come in," he said, using the excuse of a handshake to guide Taylor through the double-width doorway. The space beyond might have once been a large walk-in cupboard or inventory storage space. It was divided into two rooms, not by walls, but by thin aluminum girders, one of which had a sheet of plexiglass leaning up against it, scribbled with grease pencil markings. There were two desks, one in each partitioned space. An older woman was seated at the front desk, looking red-eyed but grim, all of her attention focused on a laptop. Her suit jacket was smudged with soot and torn at one cuff, and she had plasters on both hands. Taylor led him to the back office. "Oh, right. Sit down," he invited, pointing at the single seat behind the desk. In a surreal show of informality, he leaned his hip against the desk, half-sitting, one foot swinging free. "Where you hurt?" Taylor went around the desk and hesitated, recognizing the laptop. The one with the Help Desk Department Inventory Control sticker right there on the lid. "Smoke inhalation. Throat's a bit rough, but that's the extent of it." His voice was scratchy and croaky, but the man didn't look amused, merely sympathetic. "Good." He reached down and pulled the laptop open. Except for the cracks and scratches, it was apparently in good working order. As soon as Tanner touched the keyboard, it woke up, asking for Taylor's login. "If you wouldn't mind." Resigned, Taylor typed in his password, wondering if he could Alt F4 out of his running programs too fast for Tanner to notice. Probably not, with him perched above the screen like a somewhat fatigued bird of prey. As soon as the desktop loaded, Tanner gave the laptop a little push, moving it so they could both see. Tanner swiped at the touchpad, opening each of the command windows in turn. Surprised, Taylor darted a look at him and noted that his eyes were scanning each window in turn, as if he knew what he was looking at. "Thought so," he finally said, turning to Taylor. "You blocked the attack." "Yes," Taylor said with surprise. "The attack was good, but I managed to keep it from doing any significant damage after the explosion itself. I didn't get anything useful for an IP address or location, though." He couldn't help the hint of bitterness in his tone at that last. A great disappointment, that. Tanner huffed, shaking his head ruefully. "That's because he initiated the attack from inside. Not physically, but he got in through legitimate channels. He compromised our sister organizations, but never triggered the alerts because his connection to them was innocuous." Taylor nodded, completely unsurprised. It could have been something as simple as the hacker getting in through an off-site backup routine. Those sorts of things tended to be overlooked as the tunnels they could be. The hacker used flaws in the system expertly. I suspect that he or she either has had access for years, strategically placing small doors into the system without anyone noticing, or worked here once. Or both. "Much is my assessment as well." Taylor sat back. "How is it that of all of MI6, our entire IT security division and Q branch included, you were the only one not only to identify the threat, but to take immediate, effective steps to counter it?" Taylor hesitated. He was absolutely unwilling to bring James into this, but if Tanner was digging, it wouldn't be long before Iris started talking. Might as well be straightforward, wrapping the lie in a truth that would be corroborated. "I was, friends with a field agent. He couldn't get a hold of Q Branch once and called the help desk. We exchanged phone calls occasionally, and his stories about his difficulties at Q Branch left me to take an interest in the state of the network. I suppose, since his death, I've been hypervigilant as a distraction." To his relief, Tanner nodded. "Bit of a law to themselves, but that's not your fault." He studied Taylor's face, frowning thoughtfully. "I can't quite reconcile what you're doing in the help desk, though, with your early test scores." Well, that wasn't a place he wanted this conversation to go. In my school, please, Tanner said, wincing. There's no need to judge back quite that far. I'd rather not remember my own primary school experiences. Thanks. In my experience, Taylor restarted, slightly annoyed. Effort is rewarded with demands to accomplish even more, to be better still, to reach further, whether you enjoy the work you've been tasked with or not. I learned early not to extend myself unless the reward was absolutely something I wanted. Logical, Taylor said, as if he actually approved. What did Bond tell you about Q Branch? Not much. He was very careful not to violate security clearance issues. Taylor responded carefully. He spoke mostly about the technology planning gone, not according to plan. With another visible flinch, Taylor glanced over his shoulder at the lady in the front office. She was typing at a furious pace, occasionally stopping to rub at her eyes with her sleeve. She looked like the type of woman who should have a handkerchief on her. Then again, she also looked like the type who shouldn't be using what seemed like it might well be a high-end laptop for anything other than solitaire. She had to be someone's grandmother. Q Branch has been under, long-term management, Taylor corrected with another flinch. I'm afraid Q, that is Major Boothroyd, is no longer with us. Emma's tasked me with finding someone who... He made an indistinct gesture with one hand. Well, who can bring it into the 20th century kicking and screaming. 21st? He corrected automatically. Then, thinking better of it, he tacked on, Sir, at the end. Small steps, Taylor. Tanner said apologetically. The Quartermaster program, Q Branch, exists solely to outfit our field agents, though primarily the double O's. While you'd need to work closely with IT, communications, intentions, and R&D, your primary concern would be ensuring that our field agents have not only the gear and armaments to complete their tasks, but also up-to-date intelligence and whatever support can be provided, both in advance and real time. That didn't sound very different from what he'd been doing for James this whole time, though with sanction, access to resources, and the ability to do it right the first time. Of course, it also meant more agents, and significantly more responsibility. You want me to work in Q Branch, he stated, just for clarification. He wondered if that were normal, promoting people from the help desk of all places. He'd specifically chosen to apply for his position because no one was ever promoted out. The better you did there, the more they wanted to keep you, even to the point of rigging your performance metrics so you couldn't promote out. Well, guess, it's obvious. We need you, Taylor said earnestly. I've run my own numbers, but as a quick estimate, how much of the building do you think would have been compromised, if not for your intervention? Taylor said, running quick calculations, like even the canteen had had a worm targeted at it. 98%, I think. The sensors in the bathrooms were about the only system safe from the attack, he thought. Tanner's nod was grim. So far the death toll is at 11. I've no doubt it'll go higher as the rescue teams get through the collapsed wall outside our old office. Now consider how much higher it would have been, if not for you. Taylor hadn't really thought of it that way, but it made sense. It could have been dozens, and the death toll wouldn't have stopped when the attack was over. People would have continued to be in danger for as long as the information the hacker would have stolen had been in the wild. People like James. And he wouldn't be stuck fixing printers anymore. He'd actually be working on useful things for exceptional people. Before he could answer, the woman beyond the unbuilt wall stood, snapped a USB drive out of her laptop, and crossed into the back office, heels clicking on the concrete floor. She sniffed, but kept her chin up, shoulders back, as she walked right to Tanner. This is everything I can think of for now, but I'm certain there's more. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel Marsh, Mike Taylor. Tanner introduced, putting the USB drive down on the desk, rather than pocketing it. Danielle gave him a sad, warm smile. Mr. Taylor, she said, holding out one bandaged hand. Her nails were cut very short, and though she wasn't wearing rings, Taylor could see where she normally did wear them. Miss Marsh, he said with a pleased grin, taking her hand. I've heard a lot about you. A friend of mine, he called himself, before he could refer to James in the present tense, admired you very much. I'm glad to finally meet you, she said, patting his hand between hers before she released him. James was... She closed her eyes and swallowed. He was much more cheerful those last few months. It was a surprising compliment, as was the insinuation that James had talked about him. Danielle seemed earnest and sweet, and Taylor looked down at his hands to hide his expression. He suddenly felt more than a little dirty keeping James's secret.
Thank you for saying so. Shall we go over your proposal?
Tanner asked Danielle. Please. Tanner picked up the drive again and pushed it into Taylor's laptop rather than going back to Danielle's or a different one. Taylor sat there feeling awkwardly as if he'd been forgotten, while Tanner pulled up a spreadsheet of, well, everything Taylor read, unable to keep from leaning forward to read through his still dusty glasses. New servers, routers, switches, thousands upon thousands of feet of Cat6 and fiber with terminals and tools to apply them, and a laundry list of the components that Taylor could build into an entirely new, secure, fast network. Below that, she'd apparently begun to outfit a machine shop. Precision machining equipment, testing, and measurement tools, not one but 3 separate vehicle dynos. Everything from scanning electron microscopes to explosion-proof storage cupboards for, well, explosives. The list of firearms alone was intimidating, and that was before Taylor got to the knives and more primitive weapons, all the way down to 3 separate brands of cricket bats. Only when they got to the end did Tanner pause. A ferret.
Can you think of a better way to run cable through narrow ducts? Danielle asked. Other than a radio-controlled car, that is, and there'll be too much signal interference.
Well, Taylor didn't think that was strictly true, but how could he possibly object to what was undoubtedly a Q Branch mascot?
Right. Well,
Tanner said a bit bemusedly. He turned to Taylor and asked,
So then, what do you think?
Well, if Miss March would like me on her team, I'd be delighted, Taylor answered, smiling at Danielle.
Oh, good heavens, no, Danielle said at once. I've no desire to run the department. I have a husband who has put up with a wife in government service for quite long enough, dear.
Danielle would be your second-in-command, Tanner clarified. The choked laugh that escaped him wasn't met with respondent chuckles, so he cut it off almost immediately. Me? Ron Q Branch? He resisted the temptation to talk seriously onto that sentence, but Tanner and Danielle were looking at him expectantly. How long do I have to think about it?
Em wants to see you right about now,
Taylor said, looking at his watch.
We can deal with the pay raise and all that later. I've already pulled all of your records. Spotless security check, very impressive. You'll need another polygraph, but that's just to tick off a box on the list. Our security procedures are more rigorous than the oversight committees at any rate. It would be strictly a functional posting until you can go through personnel and all the management sensitivity training, but Miss March has done all that already.
Call me Danielle, she interrupted, looking at Taylor, not Tanner. Tanner smiled wryly.
So she can take care of performance reviews and all that for now.
Taylor stared at Tanner for a long moment. This was unexpected, to say the least. He wasn't sure he wanted the overwhelming responsibility that came with that sort of job. But then again, he thought he'd been doing it for James for months now. What would have happened to him if Taylor hadn't been around to clean up Q Branch's messes? Perhaps the attack could have been avoided completely if only someone competent had been in charge. How many field agents might have met less tragic ends? James included.
All right. Good. Danielle, source all of this and get pricing,
Tanner said, dropping off the desk.
Q, I'll take you to meet him, and for God's sake, get a cage for the ferret.
Q, Taylor thought with a swallow. How the heck did that happen? Somewhere behind M, the soft words Churchill's bunker cut through the generally quiet but persistent buzz of nervous chatter that had permeated what was left of MI6, underscored by the sounds of fire suppression systems and emergency vehicles. M stood above the turmoil, watching with cold fury as her analysts, operatives, techs, and general staff scrambled to make some sense of order out of the chaos left in the wake of the explosion. Her hands wrapped around the railing as she looked down at the flurry of activity, the still hot metal stinging her hands. The injured were being evacuated to local hospitals, and the able-bodied were doing their best to help. She wasn't angry with her staff. Well, perhaps she was in an abstract way because they hadn't anticipated the attack or been able to prevent it. But more importantly, she needed to find a target and go on the offensive. This was unacceptable. Security won't be entirely guaranteed, the analyst behind it was saying. The tunnels aren't entirely mapped out. They run for miles in unpredictable configurations, and the record keeping over the centuries has not been consistent. But they're working on it. M resisted the urge to snap at the woman. They? Who were they? How were they working on it? How were they dealing with not being able to use a single one of MI6's potentially compromised computers? She took a deep breath and held out her hand. It took the analyst only a moment to hand over the files, the raw, barely processed data that would help M begin to make sense of what had happened. She may not be the military hero that the past heads of MI6 were, but her ability to make sense of numbers was unparalleled, especially among these children who couldn't put together a chart without Microsoft bloody Excel. The character of MI6 had changed too much, she decided. They were too crippled by a dependency on vulnerable technology. But then they had that tech because the human factor was too unpredictable. Loose lips sink ships was as applicable today as it had been in the last century. Sometimes she hated the fact that the British Empire had turned all their subject nations loose to go start their own squabbles and then come running back to Mummy for help. All the work and none of the benefits. It was like having ungrateful children running up uni bills and getting ASBOs. Mom? Tana. She turned away from what might theoretically be her temporary office with something like relief. Tanner was the perfect blend of old and new, technologically brilliant, but with enough people skills to give him an advantage when dealing with politicians. He wasn't some fawning yes man, but he also didn't manage to piss her off every time she turned around. She just needed to clone about 1,000 of him, and then they'd be able to have their vengeance. He was being followed by yet another young puppy, this one looking as shaggy and disheveled as every other attack survivor, only in desperate need of a haircut. 3 hours ago, she'd put Tanner on the mission of wrangling Q Branch into something useful. Boothroyd had been too politically well connected for her to safely oust him, but the attacker had done the job for her. Not that the little side benefit made it acceptable. Mom, Q Branch reorg is on the way, Tanner said as he led the puppy up to her. About damn time, M said, relieved. She looked down at the chaos again. You've called in the double O's? Everyone working priority 2 or less. I thought you'd want the priority 1 missions to remain underway. Fine. She glanced back at the puppy again, wondering if he was some sort of intern. Bloody day to start an internship, if so. Once you get the armory organized, I want personnel protective weapons issued to everyone who's qualified and comfortable with one. Not that a terrorist is going to try a street-side mugging, but guns will buck up morale. We can recall them in a month's time. Yes, Mom. Taylor got out his tablet and made a note. Just one more reason she appreciated him. She wasn't afraid to take notes in front of her rather than trying to pretend and having a photographic memory, only to end up losing half of what she said. Once he was finished, he said, Mom, this is Michael Taylor, formerly a senior help desk technician. She blinked, baffled. I looked at the boy. Charmed, but I don't think we have any currently operational computers for you to fix. Our new quartermaster, Tanner put in. Joking, beggar, in your outburst, she said more politely. I'm sorry. Mom, he's the one who repelled the brunt of the attack. The strike on your office was the first in a sequential series. Tanner explained. The first bullet was fired at you, but the shooter kept his finger on the trigger. Taylor here blocked every other bullet from hitting. M turned to look more fully at the person who, upon closer inspection, didn't appear to be a boy at all. Casual dress and shaggy hair made him look younger than he was, though a somewhat nervous expression didn't bolster her confidence whatsoever. And how did you manage that? She asked, watching him closely. To his credit, the new Q stepped forward and squared his shoulders. I anticipated his attacks on various systems as ranked by priority and repelled them. Em wasn't an expert at network security. She'd spent too many years in the field and had given too much of her life to the old art of spycraft. The most technologically advanced way she'd ever killed someone was with a gorgeous holographic scope just 3 years ago. She did so like to keep her hand in the game, and that was only if one didn't count sending kill orders by email. She understood enough, though, to recognize what Q had and hadn't said. Did you have prior warning allowing you to prioritize, or was this just all off the cuff? I didn't have any prior warning, Q said, an edge of curiosity in his voice. I was on my way back from a help call and had my laptop with me.
Even though I was on help desk, I know the network well. I was able to use what I had on hand and my prior knowledge of our internal systems to keep the hacker at bay. She gave him another, sharper look. Not just to take in the details of his scruffy post-explosion appearance, but to see how he withstood the scrutiny, if he was going to head up Q Branch. And really, how old was he? He'd have to withstand the double O's, for one thing, as well as the section chiefs and other branch leaders. If he crumbled too easily, the double O's at least would run right over him, and God knew where they'd all be then. He kept his cool without any of the pride she might have expected after essentially declaring himself the hero of the day. Rather, there was a sense of resignation and loss about him. Well enough. She'd puzzle that out later when she had MI6 back on its feet. "Let me see your mobile," she said, holding out her hand. He raised his eyebrow, but didn't hesitate to hand over his MI6 issue mobile phone, an almost comical puff of dust coming from his trousers when he pulled it out of his slightly worse for wear pocket. The mobile was spotless, in pristine condition. He was more interested in tech than in impressing management with a spotless appearance. The boy had his priorities straight. She returned the mobile to him, saying, "Fine. Can I have security escorted back to his house to fetch whatever he needs? I expect we'll all be living here for at least the next few weeks while we get this security mess sorted out." "Weeks? Taylor hesitated, looking a bit wild-eyed. "I have a cat, ma'am." "Well, bring it here, then. We're in a bloody tunnel system, not to leave. All the better to keep the rats at bay." "I'll see to it, Mum." Tanner intervened smoothly. Em nodded, relieved that Tanner would explain things to the boy. "Go get your department in order, Quartermaster. Don't do anything stupid and there won't be any oversight. I'm pulling most of our agents back home, so be prepared to aggregate all of that intel. Get it to analysis and intentions, wherever the bloody hell they're camping. Any questions?" "No, Mum," Taylor said, sounding calmer now. She looked at him steadily, relieved to see a core of strength in him. He might just survive the next month, after all. "You have dust in your hair." "As do you, Mum," he answered without missing a beat. She grinned and turned back to the scurrying chaos. They'd lost their first battle, but maybe they'd be able to win the war, after all.